Right, so in this video, we're taking a look at kind of what happened after independence. How did they clean up after the end? How did they respond to all the issues that they were left behind with? And how did they respond to issues that came up along the way? So, kind of what happened after Gandhi and after independence. And so let's start with kind of the biggest problem that they had to deal with was the refugee crisis and the problems of partition overall. In that 15 million people had to move as a result of the split of these nations. The most difficult areas were the Punjab and Bengal regions because they were largely mixed up. In a lot of the other states, it was a majority Muslim or majority Hindu. That's pretty straightforward. There were many small people, small groups of people that had to move, but in these states, it is pretty mixed up. So they had to split states in half, and so as the borders dropped, people had to move very quickly, and so it was much more difficult. And in most cases, these new borders were announced only a few days after independence, and so they didn't have long-term plans set up. It was, guess what? You are now living in the wrong country. You need to move, and if you don't move, you risk not being protected. And again, it was perfectly legal to be of a different religion in both Pakistan and India. The law wasn't the issue. It was mostly it's religious violence. It is your neighbors coming after you, and sometimes even the police force coming after you, not supporting you. And so what was legal versus what was happening, that was a separate issue. It just wasn't safe in many cases. Again, legally, they were allowed to stay, but that just wasn't the reality there. And so millions of people had to abandon their homes in the middle of the night and leave and get to the other side of the border or risk being killed in their own homes because the borders switched in a matter of days. And Punjab was probably the worst case because of so much mixing in the Punjab, and they had to move faster. They didn't have the luxury of time, so it was okay, you have to move tomorrow, you and millions of other people. And going back, going back, it's just millions of people have to move all of a sudden. And so law and order just broke down in that you couldn't trust anybody. And in many cases, this broke down into ethnic cleansing, where just mobs are going down and hunting people of the opposite religion to clean out anybody that's not of their religion in their neighborhood. So it got really bad really quickly. Bengal, on the other side of the country, also saw movement, but this was a slower process in Bengal. It was less mixed than Punjab, and so there was still violence, but it was to a much lesser extent. By the end of the year, peace had been restored, people had moved, but again, it wasn't 100%. 40 million Muslims remained in India, which is a huge chunk. To say 40 million, that's bigger than many or not most countries. And then several million Hindus remained in Pakistan, and so there are still communities in both sides. But it was a risk for both these communities to trust their neighbors against these problems of ethnic cleansing. Both countries had to figure out large issues when it comes to paying for all this, but also to figure out where you're going to put these people. And that they left everything behind. And in many cases, a lot of these people were farmers, and so they left their farms, and where are they going to go now if there are no new farms for them to go to? And so they may have had skills in their old country that they necessarily couldn't apply in their new country. And so patterns of communication as far as telephone lines and like ways to communicate, that's shut down. Infrastructure like roads and electricity, that has to be split up. Agriculture, as far as who is making what food. It used to be specialization where this region might make wheat. Well, now each country needs to make its own wheat now. Irrigation as far as water rights. And so if irrigation used to go this way, but the border's there, you have to rearrange where the water's going to go. Trade as far as what deals we have with other countries, but also if I used to sell to my neighbor in the other state, but the other state's now a new country, it has to be a whole new deal now. And so everything has to be split up. And so just dropping a new border causes a whole lot of new problems. And it's just bloody and costs millions, if not billions of dollars. The other major issue to worry about is the princely states. What about all these little areas in pink that accounts for 40% of the population? Where do they go? Because they were not technically owned by England. They were given deals where the king of those little states got to maintain their status but maintain loyalty to England. And so part of their deal was they were free to pick a side, and most of them did. There were a few cases, and there was strong pressure for them to pick a side because otherwise they'd be little islands stuck in the middle, and they've already had strong connections to the states around them, and we don't want to have new borders. We already saw the issues of having new borders. And so there was a lot of pressure for them to pick a side. Most of them did, except for three. There were three cases where they didn't pick a side, and it didn't turn out well for any of them. As far as the major areas that didn't pick a side, it was mostly because it was a, a ruler of one religion over a people of a different religion, and they really didn't have a good choice, where it's not going to end up well for them because of that disparity and separation of religion there. And so part of the deal was they would get to keep their title, they would get to be a prince, they get to keep their palace, and they get to keep most of their wealth. In exchange, their government is taken over, but they kind of get to keep some of that actual special status as a prince. A couple messed up cases, Hyderabad and Junagadh, they were, I'm sure I mispronounced that, Muslim princes that ruled over Hindu populations. And so they were worried if they gave up their power, that they would be taken over by the Hindu populations. And so in these cases, India rolled in the army. They rolled in the tanks and said, okay, we're taken over by force. There were small cities that France and Portugal didn't want to let go, and so eventually France did let go in 1954, and Portugal, again, India rolled in the tanks, said get out. And so there were these small little cities that the French and the Portuguese were finally kicked out. So by 1961, they are European free. They are done. Kashmir is the one that they are still fighting over, and it's a just real tricky one. Because in this case, it's a Hindu prince, but most of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, is Muslim. And so both sides kind of want it for varying reasons. And so because the Prince of Kashmir didn't decide, both sides jumped in and said, mine. And this was their first war, December of 47 to January of 49. So about 12 months or so, or maybe 13. They're fighting back and forth over who gets this. Eventually, the UN steps in and arranges a ceasefire to split the state in half. Neither side is happy, and so they go to war two more times. 1965, they go to war again. 1999, they go to war again. What makes everybody really nervous about this whole thing is they now have nuclear weapons starting in the 90s. And so if there's going to be a nuclear war, people are really worried about the fact that India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons now, and they keep going to war. And we are worried that if you use a nuclear weapon in a country with such a high population, this is going to be mass casualties. And so we still are not done with this fight. The fight over Kashmir will continue. Political extremism. So there are largely right-wing groups that are pushing for certain things that they want. And so the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, they don't want an India that is secular. They want a religious state. They want India for Hindus. And they want to kick out all Muslims. They see them as a hostile threat to the future of India. They want an India for Hindus. And so they started to form their own paramilitary cells where they started to wear uniforms like this group and go out and train for the possibility of wiping out populations that are not Hindu. As far as who would be joining this is students. And we see this a bit in that a lot of times younger student groups are more apt to go into extreme movements, either left or right. We see this a lot. Refugees who are just desperate to have some revenge, but also the urban lower middle class. Again, so mostly these are kind of lower income groups that are not happy with their lot in life. They want to have a scapegoat, And so this appeals to them. And guys like Natharam Godse. He was an active supporter of the RSS, and he killed Gandhi for protecting Muslims in Delhi. And so here's what happened in the case of Delhi, largest city, and in this case, Muslims were kicked out of a lot of their houses as Hindu and Sikh refugees started to move in. And so Muslims were placed in camps. And so was this fair? Of course not. It just was. And so Muslims started to visit these camps to kind of help out and push for Muslim rights. And that's what eventually angered the RSS to the point where Godse kills him. After Gandhi is killed, the RSS is banned, all of its top leaders are arrested, and it's shut down for decades. And the leaders eventually are released after they renounce violence and agree to restrict their work towards cultural and not political matters. So they get out of politics for a few decades. And public opinion turns against Hindu nationalism for a few decades. Until the 80s. In the 1980s, this starts to swing back, and especially in the 90s. In the 90s, there was a fight in Ayura, and in this case, Hindu extremists tore down a mosque because they claimed that the mosque was built on a Hindu holy site. This led to riots back and forth. 3,000 are killed in the wave of violence, and this violence just causes more violence back and forth, and it results in a party that had close ties to the RSS coming out called the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party. And this party gained so much popularity that in 2014, this party became the majority party, and that is currently the party in charge of the government in India, because of more Hindu nationalism that's really gotten strong in recent decades. So how did they start up? How did their new constitution work out? So they decided, okay, we want a secular constitution. And largely this constitution was written by the Congress. And the Congress was the majority party for a long time until the BJP rose up. And so they have a UK-style parliament. So they have a prime minister. They have two chambers, like kind of an upper house and lower house. They like the British, but also like the Americans. And they borrow a little bit from both systems, what they like about the British, what they like about the American system of democracy. They like our federal system, in which the overall federal government has a lot of power, but the states have certain rights too and certain powers, and so they like that balance, especially because you allow the local states to have certain rights when it comes to language and religion. They also like our Supreme Court to make sure laws are constitutional. And they remain part of the UK Commonwealth, so they can remain close friends economically, politically, to the Brits. In 1952, they have their first election, 173 million voters, 84% of which are literate, and if they weren't literate, each party had a picture and people would vote according to picture. But Congress wins 75% of the seats, they just dominate. And the other parties, really, they're so split up that they really don't have a chance for a long time because they are not united the same way Congress is. Language was one of the first major fights that they had, amongst many fights, actually. India has hundreds of languages, but because of the British, English became the dominant language when it came to government, law, higher education, the middle and upper classes. So really it's the upper class that spoke English, but as a second language. And so people would have all these languages at home, but the language of business and the law would be English. And so one of the strongest languages to this day is still English, even though it's not the first language of most. And so more people speak English in India than in America. But again, it's their second language. They'll speak something else at home. Hindi is the most popular of these languages, but it's only in the northern part of India, but that's where the majority of Indians are. The Constitution recognizes 14 languages, and Hindi and English become the official languages, which really anger the people that don't speak Hindi, but Hindi was the most popular. The Constitution did allow Parliament to kind of change state lines according to language. And people were really nervous about this because, well, Nehru didn't want to have any more division. He wants everybody to get along, kind of like Gandhi's idea of just everyone getting along in one place. But the fear was, if each language doesn't get its own state, where that is the law, you're supposed to speak that language in that state, the fear was that people are just going to start to lose their language. and lose their culture. That if everyone's speaking Hindi or English, they lose part of that culture. And so they fight to have states according to language. Telugu is one of the first test cases where Emmanuel Porishrimalu was one of the first leaders, and he fasted to death to protest against Nehru's refusal to give them their own state based on language. Riots follow his death, and so finally the government says, okay, we don't want any more people fasting to death, we don't want any more riots. Fine. You get your own state based on language. This opened floodgates to later people also fasting in Gandhi's footsteps here. And so they do this several times where they reorganize their boundaries according to states. And that the old boundaries were largely ancient and they had shifted over time. And sometimes they were political, sometimes they were based on the whims of princes or the British, so they decided let's switch this up. And not all groups are necessarily satisfied with these changes, and this does lead to more riots, especially when we get further splits over time based on this. Punjab is later split up into Punjab and Haryana. Bombay is later split into Gujarat and Maharashtra. And so we get splits according to language to ensure people that can keep their language. But again, as you can see in this chart, Hindi is still huge, 422 million people speaking Hindi. We've got smaller languages here, but again, it's massive. English is still dominant, but it's the dominant second language. And ultimately, they tried to make Hindi the official language, but that angered people that spoke a lot of these other languages, and so we got more fights over this, especially Tamil in the south. We're really angry about, again, a dominant language challenging their language. They don't want to lose it. And we'll stop there.